And he is a proponent of intersectionality and all of the identitarian politics associated with the Democrat Socialist Party in 2021 America. He took to the well of the House to speak on behalf of D.C. statehood, which, as we know, passed out of the House. We'll see what kind of treatment it gets in the Senate. Here's how he characterized the importance of D.C. statehood and the opposition to it.
Mr. Speaker, I have had enough of my colleagues' racist insinuations that somehow the people of Washington, D.C. are incapable or even unworthy of our democracy. One Senate Republican said that D.C. wouldn't be a, quote, well-rounded working class state. I had no idea there were so many syllables in the word white. One of my House Republican colleagues said that D.C. shouldn't be a state because the district doesn't have a landfill. My goodness, with all the racist trash my colleagues have brought to this debate, I can see why they're worried about having a place to put it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The truth is, there is no good faith argument for disenfranchising over 700,000 people, most of whom are people of color. These desperate objections are about fear. Fear that in D.C. their white supremacist politics will no longer play. Fear that soon enough white supremacist politics won't work anywhere in America. Fear that if they don't rig our democracy, they will not win. Today, Democrats are standing up for a multiracial democracy to democratize all 51 states in this country. I yield back.
He is a critical race theorist par excellence. He must have learned it at Harvard Law School, where that oppressed member of Congress graduated after getting his undergraduate degree at Stanford in this oppressive America where black Americans don't have opportunity. For more on the topic of the philosophy behind politicians like Mondaire Jones, pleased to be joined by Ilana Redstone. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois in Champaign, co-author of Unassailable Ideas, How Uncertain Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education, and creator of the Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes video series. That's a great title for Snow. I like that. She wrote a great piece in Tablet, which caught my attention, Conflict Theory Doesn't Like You. It's a great primer on basically how we are so critical race theory obsessed, why it is part of the curriculum in so many schools. We talk a lot about it here, the basis for it, the philosophical basis for it. Professor Redstone, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So Representative Jones seems to me gave a good example of what you write about in your piece and sort of illustrate with the black person and white person in an elevator. There's other reasons to oppose D.C. statehood, especially in the way that Democrats are trying to do it with a simple majority vote of Congress. Many would argue, myself included, that if you want to make D.C. a state, you can do it, but it requires a constitutional amendment, not a majority vote of the House and Senate. So that's one reason you could be opposed to it, but he doesn't want to focus on those reasons. He wants to focus on identitarian reasons. And so your elevator example for illustration.
Right. Do you want me to talk through the example?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So in the piece, so first of all, let me just a couple things just really quick. I'll just be clear. I'm not an expert on DC statehood or the arguments there, and I'm happy to speak to sort of the broader issues. And the book is actually How Unwritten Rules, Not Uncertain Rules. So just a short correction there. No, that's okay. No problem. So the example that I use in the article and the piece is called Conflict Theory Doesn't Like You. And so, I was glad about the title, which I did not choose. Oftentimes, as probably you already know, we don't pick the titles. But the example was basically if you have two people on an elevator, and one person gets, I can't remember the exact which one gets on the elevator and which one was already there. But the idea is that if there's somebody already on the elevator, let's say, for example, there's a black woman who's already on the elevator and she gets on at the second floor, or she was on since the second floor, and somebody else gets on at the third floor. And let's say it's, just for the sake of argument, let's say it's a white woman, and the white woman who gets on at the third floor doesn't greet the black woman who's already on the elevator. And so one way of interpreting what I say in the article is that one way of interpreting that is that, is through the lens of power dynamics, and that sort of the white woman who gets on doesn't sort of doesn't see the woman who's already on the elevator as sort of worthy of her attention or time, in a way that she can just kind of, rebuff any greeting or sort of just not pay any attention. And that's driven by some subconscious or conscious sense of racial animus. And so what I point out in the article is that that's, I couldn't sit here and tell you that is impossible. Of course, that is a possible explanation, but that it's not the only possible explanation. And so, and what I want to, again, in the article, I sort of say, well, maybe the woman maybe she's having a rough day. Maybe she's claustrophobic. Maybe she's, lost in thought, who else, all these other things that could be going on. But there's this assumption that's made about when those interactions don't work out, when those interactions go sideways, particularly when they're between members of different identity groups, that the assumption is that it's because of those identity group memberships. And the problem is that you have these competing explanations, and there's no empirical way to sort of rule one out definitively or say, I'm positive it's this or I'm positive it's this. So it sort of comes back to this question of what your default assumptions are and how you want to evaluate competing explanations. And through critical race theory and conflict theory more generally, it's always going to point you toward the direction that says that the identity is the explanation. And I think I imagine sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not, but it doesn't allow for that range of the human experience and sort of all of the other things that contribute to our social interactions.
Yeah, I like the phrase you used to describe it. I think this is really elegant in describing conflict theory in one sentence. It looks into the room of social problems and shines a giant spotlight on a single aspect of the human condition, yet leaves the rest of the room dark.
Right. I think that's true. And it's interesting because someone could easily make the argument. They could say, well, doesn't every theory do that? And to some extent, I think that's true. I think that is actually true, and particularly in the social sciences. I think the problem is that when you get this expansion and this sort of it's this theory that we then it becomes a hammer and we're looking for a nail and we're using it to explain everything, rather than this is one way to look at it and here's some other, right? Sort of putting it in this broader context, which I think is where we need to be, and that's not, unfortunately, where we are.
And the evolution or devolution to where we are, you go back to Marx and the bourgeois versus the proletariat, bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And it seems to me now what has happened is folks have figured out that making these sorts of claims and reducing everything to a binary is a good way to political power. And if we can't do it through sort of economic class warfare, then maybe we can do it through racial warfare.
I don't know. I'm not sure I would characterize it quite that way, because in the same at some level, that's also making an assumption about intent, about some sort of sinister intent with a power grab. And again, there may be some of that. Well, I try to not read into other people's intent. So, but it's certainly possible. But I think that a lot of it is driven by people who are generally concerned about members of marginalized groups and the harm the perceived harm. And I think, but part of what's happened is, again, an expansion of terms, and this sort of concept creep that comes along with it, including ideas about harm, including expansion of how we think about racism. And so suddenly these terms themselves mean different things to different people in a way that makes it really hard to even have a conversation.
Well, right. Okay, so setting aside intent, you will concede, it seems you did in your piece, that, it's incredibly myopic. And to your point, and to the human interaction is layered and complicated and textured. I get on the elevator and I don't acknowledge somebody of a different race because I don't acknowledge anybody, because I don't like acknowledging people on the elevator. I'm uncomfortable.
Right.
Right.
That's true story.
But everything becomes that about the racial dynamic if it's two people of a different race, and then it's immediately set on fire in so many instances. And also you have K through 12 school systems and the academy essentially adopting that myopic view and suggesting people who don't share that myopic view, who offer an alternative theory, are not being anti-racist, to borrow from Ibram Kendi, and thus then are racist.
Right. And so actually that's now the book that you mentioned, the Unassailable Ideas book, that's actually really a lot of the premise of that book, which is that in that book we talk about essentially three kind of unwritten rules or unspoken beliefs that underpin a lot of really the entire academic endeavor. And we also talk in that book about how they're sort of propped up by direct and indirect effects of social media. But the whole point in that book is kind of what you're saying, which is that, look, these are a set of beliefs. They're a particular, they're problematic when you assume everyone has them or should have them, and it's problematic when you treat them as though they're factual. But their existence, at least the position that my co-author and I take in the book, it's not that their existence. So, for example, my own position is that, I think, yes, we should be teaching conflict theory. Teach it and teach critical race theory, but teach it in a way that is contextualized and that doesn't swap it out as a factual presentation of how the world works. And so, again, it is a social science theory, and it should be sort of held up to the light and criticized as any other should be.
Right, and so what has happened in the academy where that is not allowable in so many places? Of course, I mean, I learned about. I'm not a Marxist, and I learned about Marxism and Gramsci in high school and in college and so forth, and again bumped up against other theorists and other philosophies and other economic theories, and then you hash it out. And so that is increasingly not allowed, particularly with respect to certain theories like those advanced by the Ibram Kendis and Robin DiAngelos of the world. Why has the academy bought that?
Gosh, I've never held an administrative role in academia. I've always been on the faculty, and I've not been an administrator. Why have they bought it? I don't know. I don't.
Well, the professorate.
I think there are a lot of reasons. What?
Yeah, your colleagues, the professorate. So many people essentially subscribe to that too. That they're unwilling to consider alternative theories or criticism of that theory in particular.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think there's a longer answer that it may be longer than your audience is willing to sit for. I think it has to do with the expansion, sort of over in the latter half of the 20th century, sort of expansion of how we think. I've written about this elsewhere, and how we think about racism, and and how and why the expansion of the way that's measured changed, and sort of that corresponded and coincided with this whole influx of critical theory. But the whole issue, you sort of put your finger on it already in different words, which is that, all of the critical theory approaches, and critical race theory in particular, as it's tied to anti-racism, capital A, capital R, in terms of the movement associated with Kendi and such, is that, the assumption is that there is, again, and this goes back to what you were saying about DC statehood, is that there is no alternative perspective that is on equal moral footing. That sits underneath all of it. And so that's kind of in my own work and with students, is to try and raise questions about that, because if you can get there, then you can open up the conversation and say, well, let's open this up. Like there is, and so there are ways to do that, with groups and with students and things like that. But that's sort of, a piece of this that underlies all of it, which is, again, that this idea that there's more than one perspective that can exist on equal moral footing. I see that as key.
How do your students at U of I receive that sort of setup for how we're going to address and tackle these competing theories?
I think so. There's two classes really where I bring this up. One is, and this is, the video series is Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes, but that's actually came from a class that I teach called Bigots and Snowflakes. And so I'm teaching that now for the third time. I think, and on the other place where it comes up is I teach a class called Social Problems, which is, more general. But it comes up in both places. I think that the way that I've found to present, to sort of start these conversations, is really from a place of asking questions. And I think it is generally well received. I'm not trying to make an argument. So, for example, if you wanted to talk about, race-based college admissions or something like that. It's one of these very sort of volatile topics. You could say to students, and this is what I've done, is you could say, well, why might somebody oppose or have concerns about race-based college admissions? And well, because they're racist. Okay, so we can put that on our list. And you could even imagine an actual list if you're in a classroom with a chalkboard. And then you can say, well, is there any other reason why somebody might, oppose or have concerns about this idea of race-based college admissions? And usually when I've done this exercise, there are a couple of other things that end up on that list, 2, 3, 4 other things. And then the question is, well, if all you know about somebody is that they're opposed to race-based college admissions, can you tell which of these reasons is sort of their motivating factor? What's driving their position? And of course, you can't in the absence of any other information. And so then the question is, well, what does it mean to get it wrong? What does it mean if we get it wrong a lot? And so those are conversation questions that aren't arguing, I'm not taking a position and trying to convince people to change their minds. I'm just saying, look, this is how we talk and think about it. And that itself goes against, this isn't necessarily my goal, but it's sort of part of the whole thing. It goes against the whole anti-racism critical race theory. Because you can't, the idea, but that's the question, is that, can there be other reasons to have these concerns or to take these positions that are, again, this idea on equal moral footing? And it's hard, because the reality is that you're putting these reasons, they look the same to somebody who is, sort of an advocate of anti-racism, for example. The person who takes the position against, to just stay with the earlier example, race-based college admissions, the person who's driven by racial animus and the person who's driven by some really principled concern about the sort of allocation of admissions and whatever, and allocation of resources, they look the same. And so that, economists call it observational equivalence, but those competing explanations, that's hard. And so thinking through with students and with groups sort of, well, okay, yes, we can recognize that that's hard, but how do you want to respond to that? And how do you want to evaluate that situation? I think that that's been a fairly useful approach.
I got a great example for your class. Now, you don't have to use it.
Okay.
I'm not forcing this on your syllabus, but the Cruz Amendment to the anti-hate crime legislation that recently passed, the anti-Asian hate crime legislation that recently passed. Cruz Amendment was to prohibit federal funding for any institution of higher education that discriminates against Asian Americans in recruitment, applicant review, or admissions. Okay, that was the amendment.
Okay.
49 Republicans, all of the Republicans, voted yes to prohibit federal funding for that sort of discrimination. 48 Democrats, all Democrats who voted on it, voted no. Explain. Right? Wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't that be? Not you explain, but I'm just saying, wouldn't that be a? Wouldn't be a?
I'm like,
no.
Not that familiar with it, but
wouldn't that be a fun thought exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't actually think I'm not opposed to it. I'd have to first, do my own due diligence about sort of the amendment and everything. But I don't think it's a bad idea. So maybe I will incorporate it.
All right, if it gets into your
class. Yeah, but
again,
it's sort of getting them to think about things.
Yes.
More broadly.
Yes.
Right.
And if it gets on your class, do I get college credit for that?
I'm happy to give you credit. I don't know.
Needs credit.
I'm not the
arbiter
more
of credit.
Credit.
No, I'm kidding.
You need one more credit. I wish I
had
power. I don't
one
have
credit short. Right. One.
Right.
Professor
of a
Ilana,
life-changing degree.
Yes, right. Professor Ilana Redstone. She's a professor of sociology at the U of I. The book, Unassailable Ideas, How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. And do check out her piece at Tablet, which I'll tweet out, Conflict Theory Doesn't Like You. Also her video series, Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes, Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes video series. Professor Redstone, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. All right, take care.
Thanks. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Balance of Nature's fruits and vegetables in a capsule. Changing the world, one life at a time.
I've been taking Balance of Nature for several years, and I've recommended it to many, many people, and they're all taking it now. I think it's great for your mind clarity, aches and pains and sleeping. I'm not getting sick. It really makes so much difference. I'm just scared not to have it right now. You know, I try to eat a good balanced diet to be healthy, but you can't get all the nutrients you need. So this is insurance for me. And I think it's made a huge difference. I think this is so important. So thank you.